Thank you, Eugene, for joining Foster. We are so honored to have you. And most people may have read about Eugene's blog, Remains of the Day, which has been going on for 2 decades now. So that was quite an accomplishment just to start with. And you're also a part of the very early stage of many of the most amazing companies in the world, like from Amazon, Hulu, and then most recently you're leading the head of video at Oculus and Flipboard and early in so many companies. So, and recently I've seen a lot of your work in the creator economy space, not only on YouTube, but also a little bit podcast, a lot of writing. So we'll love to pick your brain on how you are able to consistently create so many hit pieces, like from the invisible signals to like the seeing like an algorithm, like so many pieces. And I just want to start because I noticed that you actually majored in English in college, right? And you had a lot of art training, not only in film school, but also like a lot of your ingredients of writing is actually from the media. So I'm just curious on how you bring your artist world and combine it to the business world, as you've been working in many different tech firms in the past 2 decades.
Yeah, I guess, when I was in undergrad, I had an engineering degree, but also an English degree. And I've always thought of myself as being interested in using, I guess, both sides of my brain. I don't know. There's this sort of like, this idea that we have a left brain that's more logical. It's the language center, and we have right brain, which is more intuitive. And look, I'm not up on the exact science of all of that, but I do think that we all have different aspects of wisdom. There's sort of I think in the West, especially in Western society, we tend to see language and writing and all of that as the highest form of intellectual medium. Video, some of these other mediums are treated as less intellectual, but I actually think that's just a little bit of a historical legacy of, early written culture. It was sort of like the literacy was the province of just the intellectual elites of society. So we've always said, hey, if you can read and write, you are part of the intellectual elite. And I certainly love writing. I love it as a medium, as a form of expression. But I also think there are ways in which Western society unfairly looks down on like intuitive wisdom, emotional wisdom. So I don't know, every medium has its own strengths and weaknesses, whether it's video or audio or, multimedia. They're not all equally good at all things. So I'm trying, at least nowadays, to branch out into more different types of media.
Yeah, I would love to learn more about how you are currently doing the videos, especially on YouTube after this. But I'm curious because I think, how do you actually bring those emotional wisdom, those intuition into your piece? And many of them are actually a lot of research and analytics
Mhm.
involved.
Yeah. Um, Someone I met with recently was telling me, from a book he read, and, this, I don't know if this is exact science, but I think the magnitude of order is right. It says that the conscious part of our brain processes about 60 bits per second of information, but the unconscious part of our brain is absorbing 11 million bits of information a second. So I think the problem is that the sort of intuition side of our right brain, our emotional wisdom, because it's not the center of language, it often has a hard time expressing why it knows what it knows. So left brain logic, it's very easy for me to write a piece and explain, well, here's what my thought process was, and other people can read it and follow that. But if I just tell you my intuition says X, but I can't explain why, immediately there's some level of distrust, which is natural. You're like, well, I don't know if I trust your intuition. But a lot of my pieces, that I write actually begin, I think, when I actually have an intuition about something, and I don't know why I feel that way. And so writing is a way for me to work out how it is or why my intuition is like guiding me in that direction. So I always tell people, like when it comes to big life decisions, people are trying to decide on a job or a relationship or a bunch of things. People always have this like nagging feeling or a little voice in their head, but they can't quite hear it, but they just like feel a certain way, even though they can make a list of arguments and bullet points that point in the other direction. I think that's just your intuitive wisdom sort of speaking to you.
Yeah.
And I always tell people, when we say trust our gut, there's two levels. You could say that on a metaphoric level, trust your gut. But also, we're learning now that, our gut actually is very wise. Like the gut biome has a lot of wisdom hidden in it. So there's a literal way in which sometimes when I say trust your gut, that that's what I'm referring to. And so I think a lot of my pieces begin with just this nagging feeling in my head. Often it's like, oh, everybody's saying X, but it doesn't feel right to me. Like X doesn't feel like the right explanation. Or, like I wonder why this happened this way. I feel like there's something here and I have to figure out why it's that
Yeah.
way. And so I often think my pieces are a blend of it's first my intuition that points me that way. And then my left brain is like working it out in writing.
I love that. And so much, it's a big part of my work is to help people connect with their intuition and using
Mhm.
that to guide their decision makings, right? And I think looking at your career, you sort of reset in some ways every 7, 8 years. And one quote you use is sick to be in office and try to find out the next thing that interests you. So I'm curious about like how does curiosity play in your writing? You said something like say TikTok, for example, you're looking at that, there's a couple explanations on how that works, but perhaps something doesn't ring true to you. So you dig deeper and then write a piece on seeing like the algorithm and sorting hats. Can you tell us more about how that came about? Like just taking us to your brain on how that worked and how that piece came about.
Yeah. The case of TikTok was more just an example of me observing something that went in a direction that I didn't expect. I wasn't sure that when TikTok, when ByteDance bought Musically and rebranded it as TikTok and started spending so much on advertising, my first thought was that it wasn't going to work, that they weren't going to be able to get traction with a larger audience. They weren't going to be able to break out beyond, teen girls doing dances and lip syncs. And then it did work. And so that was a little bit of a violation of some of my expectations around social. And I find social just as a topic area very interesting. So whenever something doesn't go the way I think, I've realized that like something about my mental model of how TikTok works or how social works was off and needed to be adjusted. And so I needed to figure, and I was just curious myself, um, trying to solve that mystery. And I often think that writing to me begins with my own personal curiosity about something, and then when I put it down on paper, my job, I think of as trying to transmit my curiosity to the reader. At least that's how every piece I think needs to start out. I always think of it, well, I was curious about this topic. How do I make you, as the reader, curious about it? How do I have you ask the same questions that I asked in the beginning before I started writing the piece? So I always think that's like a starting point. And curiosity to me, I measure in sort of my just intellectual energy. So I found TikTok interesting, and I just kept looking at it and researching it. And so I think about my pieces and writing as I think George Saunders talks about this as well, but he talks about maintaining an energy level throughout your piece. And so even when I get into editing and everything, I'm thinking about sentence to sentence, paragraph to paragraph. How do I keep the energy level at a certain point? And it really begins with, can I keep that energy level high for myself as a writer? If if I don't have high energy level and curiosity about a topic, I'm just not going to finish the piece. And I have luxury because I'm just writing for fun, really. It's not like how I make a living. Uh, I have the luxury of just putting pieces aside if they don't energize me. So, yeah, I think curiosity is a big part of it, and part of my career, which you mentioned, um, is a little bit about keeping my personal curiosity and energy high just with what I do.
Mhm.
And part of one of the easiest ways to do that is just start something new. To try to learn something new when you have just no idea how something works um, is a great way to keep your brain engaged.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are times in your career and life when it may just be applying things you already know, but I'm always a little bit biased towards, at least some portion of my job needs to be a mystery or an adventure.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
There are two pieces I want to follow up on. One is how do you actually maintain energy level throughout the piece? Since I think you are your own editor, where
yeah.
you actually edit the work, right? Which is very, very awesome. The other one is the energy piece, which we can talk about now, because I think a lot of the writing you talked about Amazon and perhaps Steve Jobs is they are able to pack a lot of energy in very concisely and let those energy travel very far across the company and to audience, their shareholders even more. But to start, how do you actually do that? How do you maintain that energy throughout the piece? Is it just like what questions do you ask yourself, or when do you know when to stop writing a piece?
Um, Usually it begins with I'm curious about something, a question that I think, hasn't been explained properly or that I don't understand well. It helps these days. Obviously, there's so much writing online. It helps to pick an area where maybe there's no definitive piece on a topic, or maybe there's a standard wisdom, but you feel like you have a contrarian take. It's a little bit easier, I think, to break through. But I just mostly start with my own personal curiosity, and that provides enough energy in the beginning. And then I just start jotting down random thoughts as I research a topic, and I just throw them into a document together. It's just a mess of stuff. And then when I do a first draft, I usually have like a light structure in mind, and I just assemble all the pieces. And then I will do a read through after I've gotten a first draft, um, and then see if the structure is right, if there are pieces missing in the logic. And I'm not like really wordsmithing the sentences or anything. I'm trying to just get it in the right structure. Um, then once I feel like the structure is there, then I start editing at like a word and line and sentence level, a little more detailed. And um, yeah, and then I just do as many passes as I need at that point until I feel like the energy is high throughout. At least for me, I'm reading just as a reader, so there will be sentences where you read and you're like, oh, well, actually, this is just like it's just clumsy, or it's not saying what I want it to say. Um, I think of writing as sort of you're raising questions. Well, when I was in fiction writing classes in college, there was this idea we were taught about short stories. Um, you're constantly raising questions or expectations, and then you are resolving them at different parts of the story.
Yeah.
And I think of my nonfiction pieces as somewhat similar. I need to raise the questions, like pique your curiosity throughout. So you can almost think of writing and your structure as you have a list of questions that are brought up. And then at some point, not necessarily right away, but at some point in the piece, you need to resolve them. And if your structure is good, you tend to, do a good job of resolving all of them by some point. In fiction, they have this concept of Chekhov's gun,
Yeah.
which is, oh, if you introduce a gun in act one, it has to go off in act three or somewhere along the line in the story. That's just really a way to talk about narrative efficiency. Short stories are a good form to study in college, partially because, the quarters are short. You don't have time to write a novel. But also, the thing that they beat into your head in fiction writing classes is that everything in a short story should matter. Like every sentence, every thing that you bring up, every description should have some purpose, some job it's doing. And I think for my nonfiction pieces online, I try to have a little bit of that same principle. Why am I writing this sentence? Like, does it have any purpose in the piece? Um, so that's a little bit about that. And then the sentence to sentence energy, which is like my final pass of putting things together, is really I guess something that you learn about art, which maybe they teach about nonfiction too. I never took any nonfiction writing classes, but um, if all we cared about was just transmitting the knowledge in like a really efficient form to somebody, you know, maybe we wouldn't even write as an essay. Maybe it would just be uh, like a computer program or an equation that you would just transmit to somebody. But if I'm going to take the time to write something in an essay form, um, then it matters how you write about what you write about. I want my sentences to be interesting to keep the reader's attention. Just the same way, like in a movie, you don't just have someone just like sit on camera and just describe the plot of the movie. You actually want to make it visually interesting and compelling. There's an aesthetic quality that matters. And that part can take a long time. Sometimes you just can't find the right sentence. But I think if you're a good reader, you have some intuition for what sentences you like. And I think, again, George Saunders had talked about when you revise a piece, every pass you do is just a chance for your intuition as an artist to um, act on that piece. So every pass I do, I feel like, oh, I'm giving my intuition another chance to say, oh, this doesn't work. This would be better. And then you reach some point where you feel good enough about it and you push it out. Obviously, if you write like on deadline, it's harder. You don't have the luxury of doing like pass after pass, but I don't. So I always wait until I feel like a piece is ready.
Maybe, yeah,
And
maybe
then,
that's why even though you don't write consistent or publish consistently, your pieces are consistently a hit. And maybe, yeah,
yeah, that might be part of it. I mean, I wish I had time to write more. I've done more client work in the past few years, so that's like more private writing, and it doesn't see the light of day. But I also, if you read my blog from way back in the early days, I was writing every day, but very short. It wasn't really even like essays or anything. And I think once Twitter and social media and, all these things came along, I started reserving my blog just for longer pieces. I don't know,
mhm.
because I felt like there are other outlets for things. Like if you just wanted to post a link to something or a photo, you could do that elsewhere and reach a wider audience.
Yeah, yeah.
And
And I think even though you didn't take nonfiction class in college, my creative nonfiction class in college has a similar idea and like close when you're creating new questions and closing the loop throughout the piece. It's almost
Mhm.
like you're creating a movie where the essay itself is a movie and you have to let the readers, the lead listeners sit through the movies intrigued enough to continue finding and digging stuff so that they feel smart, right? So love that. And since you touch upon how your curiosity is your intellectual energy, I have to ask because like I think when you said in another interview or another blog, minimalism or like how to convey maximum information in certain communication is an art that you
Mhm.
have observed in the front row at Amazon and beyond,
Mhm.
right? So how can you tell us more about maybe how it is done within Amazon and what you observe outside, maybe from Steve Jobs or other great thinkers and writers of the age?
Yeah, I think not just in writing, but in all fields of sort of human endeavor, we see there are these breakthroughs. And I think of a lot of these breakthroughs in different fields like science and art and uh, you name it, to be like a more efficient compression algorithm. If Einstein comes up with E equals mc squared, that is like a compressed expression of a certain truth about the world. And it's the same for my pieces and everything, whether it was Jeff Bezos at Amazon trying to capture the company's strategy for a year in a memorable form, we know that when you come up with a more compressed, elegant expression of an idea, it's more memorable. And I think it's partially my theory is that it's just part of the way that human brains operate. We're processing so much information from the world all the time that you actually need a compression algorithm just to sift through all of that. We're constantly just identifying patterns in the world, and because we have a pre-built like compression module, we don't have to just like process it from scratch. Whether it's like visual stimulus or audio or words that we're reading on a page. Um, so I think of my pieces as like, how do I compress a bunch of ideas into the most elegant form, but not lose anything? Like, what's like the most efficient but lossless compression of a
Mhm.
concept? And you never will get perfectly close with anything you write. Like, you'll never be able to match actually what is true, what you're trying to say, but there's a way you can get closer to it. And different mediums are just better at expressing certain things. For example, I could tell you right now about some glass of wine I had, and I could try to describe it for you. Um, if I were just to write that down, there's only so close I can get to it. The best way for you to experience what that wine tastes like is just to drink it. It's so I'm always trying to think about like what medium is the best way to convey what I'm trying to say. For example, I have a little of a pet peeve about fiction. A lot of fiction has descriptions of people. And for
Mhm.
some reason, I can never just like, I read the descriptions and it never really resonates for me. Like, I can't picture, like, I would rather just see a picture of a person. But, of course, then that would be like film or a different medium or photography. Um, so, yeah, I don't know. I think of every medium having like
Yeah.
different strengths and
And I
weaknesses.
mean, you have studied and created with many of those different medium, right? So
Yeah.
curious how you see them work differently, like maybe in video, maybe in visual, in text. Like how do you balance where do you put your creative outlet in each of them?
Yeah. I think naturally, depending on what you're trying to get across, one medium or another will just jump out as being clearly superior for talking about that. For example, there are a lot of music podcasts now that analyze, classical music, analyze pop music, and it's the perfect form for it because they can actually just play the music and talk about what is happening. Whereas in the past, if you read a review of an album, it's just like so hard without hearing it to know what they're talking about. They might be like, "Oh, this song is like this or that," but until you hear it, you're just like, there's such a gap between. This person I met recently was talking about maps,
Mhm.
and he has this good sentence I like. It's about closing the gap between the map and the territory,
Mhm.
which I always think of like every piece of whatever I put out there, whether it's an essay or a video or an audio, is a map to something I'm trying to say. The actual thing itself is the territory. So if I gave you a map of New York, there's a lot of information lost about New York, but that's intentional, right? They're not going to show you every last detail. They just want to give you the rough, most important things. Um, but when it comes to sharing ideas or convincing somebody of something, I'm trying to close that gap between the map and the territory as much as possible, and different mediums will suggest themselves. For example, a lot of film analysis also, I love actually watching film essays, video essays. There just aren't a lot of them because of copyright and trademark laws make it very difficult
Mhm.
to even upload that without it getting pulled down for like, copyright violations or different things, which is sad. That's just a legal thing.
What's
But
your favorite video essay channel?
well, there used to be this YouTube channel called Every Frame a Painting, which was just this couple, man and woman, who were really into film, and they would create these video essays. And the videos they made are still up. But eventually they stopped because I do think they talked about just how difficult it was to go through. They would upload it to YouTube, it would
Yeah.
get pulled down, they'd have to edit it, re-upload it to try to get past all the, like fair use, to keep it within fair use rights. And I think that's sad. I think when you lock down a medium like that, you just make it harder for other people to appreciate it.
Mhm.
But yeah, for people who love film, that's a great one. There's another YouTube channel called like Stories of Old, which is yeah similar. You know, they cut together pieces. They get around some of the fair use problems by not using a lot of the audio from the movies. They just use little clips, and then they use open source music
Yeah.
and voiceover to talk about it. But yeah, I suggest that one for anyone who loves movies.
So Story of the Old and Every Frame of Video of Painting, right? I think I saw that on Vimeo or somewhere where
Yeah,
no
it's
longer
on
on
Vimeo.
YouTube, but yeah. There's
Yeah.
there's a good questions. Your thoughts, say 10 to 20 years later, what's the importance or what's the role of writing compared to say video or audio and other
Mhm.
medium?
Yeah. Well, I think, look, I love writing and it'll always be important. And a great way, for example, like I think writing is one of the best mediums to work through a lot of abstract thinking um, and complex sort of like abstract thinking. If you have to string together a bunch of logic and everything, there, writing is still a great medium to that. But I have no doubt that writing will decline in importance relative to video and things just because you have a generation of kids who grew up with a smartphone that had a video camera in it, and they've been uh, shooting and editing and posting stuff for their entire childhoods. And I never got exposed to anything like that until I was out of college and in film school. So I think this generation is just much more visually literate. And again, I do think we're biased towards literacy, like writing and reading, as the most intellectual medium. But it's not clear to me that video isn't just as powerful medium in its own right. I think we associate television with sort of like, intellectually frivolous or empty content. And so we've always been biased that way. But, you look at this generation of kids making TikToks now. You look at a generation of kids who default to sending snaps instead of text messages. There's clearly going to be a huge generational shift. And I think when that generation grows up and enters the workforce, they will understand the power of video and audio, and they'll have been kids that had a YouTube channel with hundreds of thousands of viewers for a long time, and they'll bring that with them professionally into the world. When Steve Jobs does a product unveiling for Apple, he doesn't send out an essay about his new products. He puts on this huge show that he rehearses for months on end with all this production because he knows that that is the best way to sell, whatever, the new iPhone, the new MacBook Pro, the new iPad. It's more compelling way to convey that. So again, I think it's more about just choose the medium that's right for the job.
Yeah.
Um, there's a reason that companies, when they do interviews, have you in and have you meet with people. I'm not saying that's the best way to choose the best candidates, but it's hard to tell if you can work well with a person until you've sat across at a table with them. And when you sit across, you know how that saying that like people make their decision on the interview in the first like
First impression.
90
Yeah.
seconds or whatever. How does that happen if the person hasn't even spoken to you? And that's because of that unconscious right brain part of you that's processing all this information about that person, their body language and everything. That's something, by the way, that's been lost, I think, with all this remote work is we don't understand and value how high bandwidth the physical world is and how much information we as humans take in through all of our senses at all times. Look, I hated commuting to work as much as the next person, but I also do think there's something dangerous about purely going to remote work. There is some connection between people that will be lost for sure.
Yeah. And I think tying back to what you started, video or those very high bandwidth media is using your full brain instead of just using on your left like logical brain. So there's something to say about that, where if everyone has a video camera snapchatting or instagramming growing up, the establishment of what like a success is will be quite different moving forward.
Yeah. And people always talk about Amazon with their 6-page memos. And, I was there when that 6-page memo thing went in in the very beginning, and I had to write a bunch of memos for Jeff. But I think what people miss is that when you read those memos at Amazon, then after everybody's read and marked up the memo, then you have a period where everybody's in the room debating different things, which to me is more like a form of Socratic debate. It's like oral culture. And that's all just as important as the memo itself. The memo is like a way to force a certain amount of logic and thinking to happen up front. But then Socratic debate, in-person debate, that oral debate is the way in which you challenge and stress test those ideas live. And I often think that when I'm rereading my pieces and editing them, I'm trying to act as my own Socratic opposition. I'm like debating myself and trying to challenge my things. And often, if you write it down, you'll read your work and you'll realize if you've given it a little bit of space and time, you realize where your logic doesn't hold up.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I don't know if this actually is convincing or compelling.
I mean,
Um,
it sounds like the 6-page memo is this proof of work, like this hurdle you have to get through to have those Socratic debates, which is actually where innovation or decision is made.
yeah, it's well, the 6-page memo form comes with a certain structure, and then writing as a medium comes with certain demands. And so all of those are just, you're forcing those demands upstream in the process. You're forcing a team to at least have gone through that amount of thinking. And then, that's not the finished product. Then you have the in-person debate. I often think of it like writing and editing. I think of as like coding and debugging a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And there's
Interesting.
advantages to pairs programming, or to have a code review from a neutral person that doesn't know the code, the way didn't write the code the way you did. Um, and I think of Socratic debate as like a way in which you're having someone review your code and sort of challenge it in a way, which is useful. I mean, I do wish I actually had an editor uh,
What's
that
stopping you
wasn't
from getting
myself.
one?
That wasn't myself. That like you read about writers at the New Yorker and famous um, institutions like that, and they all talk about the huge role that their editors played
Mm-hmm.
in shaping their work. Even writers, people who write novels, the most important relationship in their life often is with their editor. Um,
I mean,
it's
I think,
important to have that.
yeah, you mentioned in one piece, like from the New Yorker, like personal best, where like having that feedback loop from like either exec coaches or like just getting feedback is very important, right? So I'm curious, when you write, even though you edit your own work, where do you seek those feedback? Like from yourself, maybe, or from other audiences?
Yeah, I mean, mostly right now myself, but then of course I hear from my readers, and it's good to hear both negative and positive feedback from different people. I tend not to be like, people never believe me when I say this. I actually don't look at like the numbers on my pieces. Like, I don't know how many people read them. And I do that intentionally because I don't want to be necessarily metrics driven. It's not that it's not important. Like, if nobody read my pieces, then that would tell me something for sure. That's important to know. But beyond some number, I actually don't know that it's that useful. And I think if you're trying to be the best writer on your reader's behalf, in a way, you always need some distance from them, um, so that you can be the best advocate for, like, you can retain your fresh, I don't know, original ideas that brought those readers to you in the first place. I always worry about having too tight a feedback loop with your readers and then being just giving them what they think they want.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same for product development. If you're building products, you can follow the metrics down the wrong path and be stuck in this like local minimum. So
Yeah.
um, yeah, I think that. But the thing that's most important to me is sometimes I'll get readers who write me long emails after I've written a piece with different thoughts and reactions, and that's probably my favorite form of feedback. Like, I mostly write to engage with other like curious minds,
Mm-hmm.
that teach me a lot of things. So my favorite thing is just to meet someone new who writes me, and they're like, "Oh, I read one of your pieces, and I had some reactions and other thoughts, and they bring new perspectives that that, like, I'd rather have one of those emails than, 1,000 likes on Twitter or something like that.
Yeah. And I think the other interesting thing which you recently did is you, even though you don't monetize your writing, you did go on Substack for like say updates for folks, right? Who maybe
Yeah.
don't use RSS anymore. So
Yeah.
curious of your thoughts around writers who go independent, either on Substack with like the grant or just like monetize in different ways. Like what's your thoughts around that direction?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great time to be one of these writers. You get effectively infinite distribution. You can set your own price. You can find an audience. Certainly, if you want to write for a living that way, this is like the golden age to be an independent writer. It's of course easier if you pick a area and focus on it. Like I've probably been bad about that in the past. Like I write about random things, and but the writers that do really well tend to focus on a topic area or a domain, and go really deep on that. Your most successful writers, I feel like, tend to be of that form. You could be more of a general personality writer type of person. It's just a little harder to aggregate a high paying audience, you know, and especially if you write about things that are important to some people professionally, they can even expense the subscription and everything. So if you write about finance or tech or investing or, areas like that, you could get it. So, but I think the first thing is you have to write about something that interests you. I think, at least for me, that like makes it sustainable. Otherwise, it just seems miserable. Um, so I always think it begins with curiosity, and how your own energy is high. I think we've all had some experience in our lives of working on some project where you work through the night and then the sun comes up and you're just like still wide awake because you're so engrossed in your work. Like people call it like flow state or whatever you call it. If you can find something like that, that's the dream. I think that's the ideal. And then beyond that, I you know putting using Twitter to drum up distribution for your work. There are a bunch of tactics, I think, if you want to be a professional writer, that are pretty tried and true. I don't necessarily follow all of that because I don't write for a living.
Mm-hmm.
I just write for fun mostly.
Yeah,
But
and
yeah,
I think one question which many folks may have as well is people always see you as this very original thinker, right? Like you always have your own POV, perhaps primarily driven by your own curiosity and your like research into those realms. And my take is that you always have a way of understanding how things work in a very unique way. And my question is, how do you usually cultivate those POV? Like, what is there any sources you would like something New Yorker read, but like are there any sources or inspirations that you always tune into to build your own POV?
I think, well, I think it helps to read a lot, first of all, in different fields. So I've always tended to be more of a generalist in my reading. Like I like reading books from all different domains and topics. Again, because I think the easiest thing in Western society is to fall in love with like a very specific framework, um, and then to just have it shape your entire worldview. And I'm always nervous about any one framework, dominating my brain. So I want to accumulate a lot of different ideas. And I think my interest, even from working at the intersection of media and tech, is that the most interesting things for me are where you bring wisdom from one domain into another that just doesn't see it because they have blinders on. So that means I necessarily have to read in a lot of different topic areas, but I enjoy that. So it's good. It's easy for me. And then beyond that, again, it comes down to, I think once you have enough of that, like reading under your belt, um, and then it just comes around like being like, challenging or just thinking about a lot of the conventional wisdom that comes at you about different phenomenon in the world, or just going to an area where there isn't any conventional wisdom at all and trying to figure out if you can help explain why something works. David Deutsch writes about the power of explanation, good explanations. in his book, The Beginning of Infinity. And that's always stuck with me. I'm always trying to find the next best explanation for anything. Um, and I actually think in many fields, especially tech, where I've worked most of my career, tech is such a young field in areas like social, when it comes to talking about social networks and TikTok, there's just not a lot of built up knowledge yet, but people are still trying to figure out how do you run a company optimally? Like, what's the right setup for an information based, knowledge work based industry? They're just like all sorts of topic areas where I don't think there's actually a lot of understanding yet. And so it's great. That means you can go in and try to figure it out. Um, and yeah, I don't know. And then the thing that circling back to intuition, I think, if you absorb enough, I do think you will have a lot of unconscious wisdom. And at that point, you just start listening to that, like trusting your gut a little bit when you think, something's not right here, or we don't understand this. Um, and there's plenty of room for that because if you have ever been on the inside of any tech company, as I have, even for a company like Amazon, which was very smart and thoughtful about what it did, a lot of what happens is by chance. But then they have to come up with a story to explain it in hindsight. And so they'll explain like this or that. But when you're in the middle of it, you realize it's like sometimes it just happens randomly. Um, and a lot of the explanations companies give for, why something is working the way it works or why they did something is just like myth making. So there's room for someone to come in and analyze what's really happening.
Yeah,
Uh,
and I guess a lot of that, what you're saying is get in touch with the raw data where you can actually see how things take place instead of like buying the story told by the company or reporters afterwards.
yeah, I think it's the great thing about analyzing consumer tech, which is most of what I spend my time on with my longer pieces, is that all of it is just out. Most of it's out in the open. The financials are out in the open. You can use the app yourself. You can like study the app, how it's designed. It's all in the open. Of course, they'll always keep some stuff private that you can't look at, like some of the data you can't get at. But I think it's easier for me when I can actually just play with the product. And I do think that one of the things we've underrated about product development and product design, and even writing as a medium, is that often what matters is how that piece of art or that application or that product or that service, how it makes the audience or the user feel. Like, how
Hmm.
does it make you feel? You can give all sorts of justifications for someone used this product because it's priced at $5 but it provides utility of $10, so there's like a $5 consumer surplus, and so the person chose that product. But so many decisions that people make about what they consume is really just emotional. They may justify it with some logic and everything, but this is one of the biggest things I've realized as a product person over the years. It's like really important to think about what your product makes a user feel. And so I think it's the same for my writing. When I'm
Yeah.
reading it, yes, I'm like thinking about if the sentence makes sense, if there's logic, and if the structure is right. But I also just like, I'm like, oh, is this like make me like, is this enjoyable to read? Am I
Mhm.
enjoying reading my own work? Is it fun in some ways? That matters more than we think.
And is that the same about how you want the readers to feel as well?
Yeah, I mean, especially in this age where there's just so many distractions. And my pieces now tend to be really long. Like a lot of people write me and they're like, "Oh no, like I don't want to read. It's like so long." And so it's like you have this huge burden of responsibility to make it interesting enough that someone will get through it. And it's not that I want every reader to make it to the end of every piece I write. I don't make that my aspiration, but for the right reader with the right curiosity, I do feel responsible. Every artist in the end is responsible for everything they put out and every sentence and everything. And George Saunders wrote in his book on writing, which it's just fresh in my head because I've just read it. He says an artist takes responsibility.
Hmm.
Um, and that's
Yeah.
big, right? He uses this metaphor of, those like motorcycles with the little sidecar.
Hmm.
And he's like, you, the writer, are driving the motorcycle and your reader is in the sidecar. And so ideally, when you swerve left, the reader goes with you. And you swerve right, the reader goes with you. And you want that reader on your hip the whole time.
Hmm.
And the problem comes when you go in a direction and the reader doesn't follow you. They just like fly off the side of the cliff. They lose interest. Um, so I think of that a lot.
Yeah.
Uh, like how do you keep that writer there? And part of doing it is like, we've all been to some party or you're at lunch with a bunch of people. Someone is like, oh, I have this funny story, and they start telling the story, and you know, uh, it's a question of does that story hold your interest?
Yeah.
Someone tells a joke and like maybe they drag it out too long, and at some point you just like check out. So that's the challenge, right?
And
To
I think
keep that story fresh.
that challenge, that question you pose is also what you like. The next question I wanted to ask is, in your words, like the big bang of content, right? As a content
Yeah.
creator today, how do you stand out when people are like having, say, entertainment or other appealing, say, Netflix series or Joe Rogan podcast, like to tune into in the fingertip? Like, how do you structure your creation in a way to not hook them, but like get them engaged enough with what you're creating?
Yeah. And again, it depends on what audience you're trying to attract. Are you trying to attract a mass audience, a niche audience? I'm lucky because I just write for fun. So I'm mostly focused on like a reader who would be curious about the same things I'm curious about and keeping that person engaged. I'm not trying to interest like every random person in the world.
Mhm.
Uh, and I think that's part of the secret in this age of so much content. It's becoming harder to write for the masses, because what does that even mean? We're starting to recognize that everybody has unique interests and they can find more things targeted at their specific interests. So I do think it's better nowadays to write for a very specific reader, even like one specific reader in mind. Like some people say they write for one reader. I never write for one reader, but I'm not writing for every reader. Uh,
Mhm.
and I think everybody needs, whether you're making a TV show or a movie or whatnot, it's better to be specific.
Yeah. And I think there's a curious question. Someone asked if you ever intentionally made your essay a bit more complicated so that you can engage your readers more.
uh, I never intentionally try to make things complicated, but I do try to never simplify things to a level where I feel like you're losing some of the truth of what it's
Mm.
about. I don't profess to know everything about everything. And there are a lot of phenomena I study which I know are more complex than I make them out to be, but I'm always trying to minimize the amount of simplification. Sometimes and sometimes I think it's okay. Before I was talking about like, hey, you're always raising questions and then resolving them. I actually think also sometimes it's okay just to raise the right questions, even if you don't know how to resolve them. Your readers are smart, and maybe they will go down and figure it out for you or learn from it. So I think just even raising the right questions in this day and age can be fine. Like I'll
Yeah.
leave sometimes open questions. It's like movies you watch which don't resolve
I
themselves.
hate those movies.
Like
Yeah.
Inception is more interesting because the top is still spinning at the end. In a way,
Hmm.
there's a little bit that's left mysterious. Uh, it's. I think one of the things that's great about a lot of topics is that there is an element of mystery to them that keeps people intrigued. And sometimes it's enough just to point at the mystery and say, wow, that's really fascinating.
Yeah.
I don't know why that is, but it's cool. And people will respond to that.
And kind of following on that, what are some of the questions that you're wondering or exploring right now?
Um, gosh, there are almost like too many to think about. Certainly on the social front, I think because we're at this tail end of, I think, the first generation of Western social apps, I'm interested in what's next, or where we may have gone wrong with some of the social apps, and I have a piece on that I'm working on, um, that thinks about that. I think the impact of the internet on the world is still understudied in some ways, and not like well understood enough, and that can go in a variety of different fields. But society in general, every time we've had a new medium come to dominance in history, whether it was the printing press or the television or the radio, uh, the effects of that were felt on, for centuries and decades at least. And the internet is still relatively young as a medium. And then if you look at the history of the internet, social networks only came along like halfway through that period. And they've only been with us for whatever, 15, 20 years. And we've already seen crazy ripples in society. And I think what is, I don't know if it's concerning, but it is, I guess, concerning, is I think we're starting to see the weird mismatch between governance, and the model, like these old politicians and state leaders and government institutions, the mismatch between their model of the world and their model of media, and then what actually is happening in the world.
Yeah.
And that often leads to a lot of societal strife, like we're seeing now. A lot of weirdness is happening. I also think it's interesting to think, I'm not a crypto like expert or a crypto zealot by any stretch, but I think it's interesting to me, that crypto came along at a time that I do think a lot of a younger generation, like the Gen Z millennial population, were already a little bit disillusioned with, financial precarity that came out of this like dominant, like several decades of, the dominance of neoliberal thought, and philosophy. And I think there's a reason. I'm in New York right now, so I keep running into all these like weird young crypto zealots at like functions and parties, and I just find that an interesting moment in time that,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I'm more in the middle of now that I'm in New York. I think the rise of video as a medium, short video and TikTok and things, is interesting because, like I said before, I think video is underrated as a medium, and I'm really curious to see what a more visually literate generation does
Mm-hmm.
with it.
Yeah.
I'm interested. I like all sorts of topics. I'm interested in actually like companies and how they operate, and this model by which we run companies, especially in the remote work situation. This model of hierarchical corporate structure really, came out of the post World War II. Kind of like a, I don't know, like a legacy coming out of the military. A lot
Mm-hmm.
of corporate leaders came out of the U.S. military, and now that we're in a more knowledge work based world, it's questionable whether that's still the ideal model for this type of work. But I don't know.
Yeah.
We stuck
Yeah.
with it, and but now with remote work, I think you're going to see a generation of companies experiment with other models, and I think that's fascinating as well.
Mm-hmm. So like future of work, how, yeah, that
Yeah, a little
makes
bit.
sense.
And I do think we're also in this weird transitional state between, like, people talk about the metaverse and they always think of like Ready Player One. We're wearing headsets and like we have like virtual avatars and bodies. And I worked at Oculus, and that was like a big thing we like studied a lot. I actually think that's further off than people think, but this intermediate state that we're in, which is a mix of the real world and the digital world, is kind of a metaverse. It's like a weird hybrid. It's kind of like we talk about hybrid work, which is like not remote work, not all in person, but the way we spend our lives, in half in the real world, half in the digital world, that is also like a version of hybrid. That's like
Yeah.
hybrid metaverse. uh, and that's interesting to me. I feel like there's a way in which that could take a big step forward, which is part of what I'm out here in New York thinking about. But,
Mhm.
I don't know. Yeah, I always find there's so many there's so many interesting topics.
Yeah, and
There's
I
no
think this
ending.
begs the question, like, what's next for you? Like, what would anything you would like to share with the audience? Like, how they could check out more of your work and etc.
Well, I'll try while I'm out in New York to put out a few more pieces. I've been bad about that recently because I've been had so many projects, but for sure, if you follow me anywhere on Twitter or Substack or my blog, I'll put out more work. Um, I don't know. I always welcome people to just email me or drop me a DM or whatever if they want to chat about anything interesting. Um, And yeah, what's next? I think I'm going to go back out in the operational side and do a startup, something in that. I'm trying to figure out again. It's like about personal curiosity. So there's a couple areas I'm interested in, but that's a lot of what I'm out in New York thinking about right now. Is
Nice.
what's next for me professionally, and I just feel like honestly, there's no better time to be doing your own thing than in this era. In a previous era, if you started a company and it failed, you might be ostracized from society or just ruined. So whatever people out there enjoy doing, whether it's writing or making videos or things, I tend to think in the West we tend to dismiss uh, when someone is tagged with the label influencer. They tend to be dismissed, and then now we call them creators, and it's like a little more sounds a little more respectable. But honestly, it's just people doing stuff that interests them. I think it's great that there are people who are so passionate about whatever it is
Yeah.
and putting work out there. And it's still so early. Some of them will burn out, some of them will decide it's not for them. But I think it's healthy that people have that choice and that the economy will take on a structure that allows a little more the individual entrepreneurs and things. Yeah, that's
Yeah, that's we look forward to hearing more about your next steps, your new articles on either your blog, Remains of the Day, Substack, which are all linked in the podcast file. But thank you so much, Eugene. It was such a blast. We learned so much from you, from not only writing, but also like how you see the world, how you break things down and create what's what's coming next. But thank
yeah.
you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
Have a good
take
weekend.
care. Bye.
Bye.